Hello, everyone. Welcome. We are so excited to be with you and talk about a topic that we love. We do have a quick poll up. If you could, let us know who you are, parent, guardian, student, educator. And if you are a parent, guardian, or student, what grade you're in. That way we can just make sure that we're very aware of who you are and where you come from on this important topic that is college admissions testing, what you need to know. So we're going to give maybe a minute more for folks to join. Logistically, to answer a couple of logistics, which I think we've all been on so many of these webinars, you will get a link for the recording of this webinar and the presentation materials. Towards the end, we'll also share with you the ability for rising seniors and juniors to sign up for some practice tests. You'll get from Jed just how critical practice tests can be. And that's something that we're seeing as college counselors as a focal point for the rising juniors and rising seniors that we work with. Okay, maybe 30 seconds more on the poll, and then we will dive into what will be a very meaty conversation. Okay, thanks so much. Let's dive in.
Let's jump in.
We want to introduce ourselves and welcome you. Jed Alperuth is a nationally recognized expert on all things standardized testing. I'm Bob Carlton, and I'm a senior college coach who works with kids across the country. We want to make sure you understand what our goals are for this session. This session is the beginning of a 3 webinar series on planning for the coming year. It's hard to believe, but summer is probably 4 to 6 weeks away from being wrapped up, and we are seeing parents and kids start turning their attention. So this is the first of a 3 webinar series, this one about standardized testing, and we've done that purposely because we're seeing a rush of rising juniors start their test prep. We'll have a webinar in August all around jumpstarting the priorities for the fall. And then in mid-September, we'll double back, and for students and parents where learning differences are a primary part of their journey to college, we'll have a webinar dedicated to that. Next slide. In terms of what we want to accomplish, the trends. Why do test scores matter? It's a different landscape than even 2 years ago. Updates on the SAT and ACT. Spoiler alerts, one of them has changed dramatically. And then we'll end with a very clear game plan on what we're suggesting students and parents consider for their priorities. I'm going to give you sort of table setting, and then I'm going to turn it over to my esteemed colleague. When we work with students and parents, the headline that we give them is the most significant shift from the college admissions cycle that just ended. So for the high school class of 2025, is that standardized testing is back, even at test optional schools. It's the first year since the pandemic that more kids submitted than chose not to submit. More than half of the 20 most selective schools in the United States are requiring the schools again. I'm stealing one stat from Jed. Jed has a whole host of stats. But at schools like UVA, at schools like Georgia, test scores are a significant input into how they evaluate applications. And what we always advise students to do is to look at the target quartile for the top quartile of that school's admitted cohort. That's where we're seeing a test score having an impact on a student's applications. Now, we'll also focus on the fact that for competitive majors, primarily STEM and business, the math component score is particularly important. And the last thing I would say before I turn it over to Jed is that you really do need to understand that in a world of great inflation and in a world of surging applications at the most competitive schools, test scores are a critical way for these admissions offices to both prioritize students to go on a deep dive, but also for a way for them to understand what will make the difference in a yes or a no for a student. With that as context, Jed, can you dive in and give everyone a deeper understanding? I will let everybody know we do have Q&A on this webinar. We'll try to answer your questions. Some of them may be too detailed for us to answer, but please use the Q&A box, not the chat box, and I'll man that as Jed dives in and takes us through what you want to know about standardized testing right now. Jed.
Thank you, Bob. Appreciate that. And so in this world, my experience has always been on the academic and testing side. And Bob has been helping kids get into college, and he understands the whole landscape of applying. And so we're going to hopefully take full advantage of his expertise during the Q&A. But the meat of this, I'll be talking about testing, and then we'll really open this up and we'll see where it goes with your Q&A. So the landscape has changed. Many of you at this point are well aware that post-pandemic, test optional, it went big. And at one point, every school in the country was test optional. But now we're seeing a slow return from the top schools in the country. But the fact that more than 3/4 of all colleges are test optional does not mean that they are blind to tests. Not at all. Tests are still impactful. There are many things that are optional yet impactful in terms of taking rigorous courses, how you do on those courses, and leadership, other things. There are many things that are optional, but they still have an impact. So they still matter. Some of these schools, top ones in the country, are now test required, and this list will only grow over time as schools, even like Caltech was test blind. They flip from we will not look at test scores at all to we now require them. And that's interesting coming from a tech school like Caltech, but they followed after Stanford. And we expect more top STEM schools to return to testing. I'm waiting for Carnegie Mellon. Rice just has some new context that we expected for kids in computer science. Essentially, their language is just getting more clear and more strong. But many top schools are returning testing for many reasons. We're also seeing the most recent one was Ohio State. They returned earlier in the winter months. And we're going to see more schools like that coming back. UT Austin, that was last year. 8 of the 20 schools in the Georgia system, all the schools in the Florida system. So we expect more Southern flagship to come back, and potentially others, very strong schools, even public Ivies. I'm waiting for UNC Chapel Hill to come back as well. I think it's simply a matter of time until they go back to required. Schools that are very selective, flagship schools, they're trying to whittle down these enormous flood of applications, and test scores are a means of doing that. So this is the timeline. I live in Atlanta, and Georgia came back pretty quickly to test requirements. They didn't even last a year. Then Georgetown, MIT, Tennessee, Purdue, Dartmouth, Yale, Brown. And then last year, there was a big slew of them. This year, it was Miami, Penn, Ohio State. And we're seeing a few programs come back, test required, like for engineers or computer science. But no other schools have gone full test required since Ohio State. But there's more of that coming. And again, like Johns Hopkins came in August of last year. So it could be next month, it could be in a few weeks. So we'll see how it plays. One thing to think about is if you're curious what schools might be next, I'm looking at Princeton and UNC. Schools like this where like the majority of students who are accepted and who enroll have test scores in their applications. And so that really is very meaningful, very impactful. And so like Penn was on the list, and Penn came back test required earlier in the year. Chicago could return in any minute, UVA, UNC, Princeton, Emory, and so forth. The rationale, why do schools go back? MIT came back pretty early in the mix. And what they found is that without that math score, we cannot predict who will fail out of MIT and who will do well here. And so it was a means to protect kids who may be vulnerable, because you might get an A in your calculus class, but if you have an A in calculus, but a 620 on the SAT, you probably don't belong at MIT. So they needed that validation, that confirmation. That could also come from getting a 5 on BC calculus, but not all kids submit that, or it might happen in their senior year. So having a math score is a way to measure for them, for MIT. And at Brown, they found that test scores are a better predictor than high school grades because of all the grade inflation. Same thing at Yale, same thing at Dartmouth. High school GPA explains less than testing by itself. And then over at UT, test submitters, they were half the way through freshman year. People who sent test scores had average grades 0.86 grade points higher than non-submitters. and also were much less likely to be on probation academically and risk of failing out of UT. So test scores are doing something for the state schools and for these schools of selective and for the STEM schools. So that's why we expect over time more schools to return to test requirements, though it may not be as rapid of a return. It could be over the course of the next 3 or 4 years. Opportunity Insights was a research group out of Harvard that sparked some of this big test return. It fueled the move at Dartmouth and then Yale and then Harvard and Stanford. And they had this graph. They looked at 1.5 million plus applications to these Ivy plus schools. There's Ivies plus Stanford, Duke, MIT, and wait a minute. There was one more, Chicago. So Ivy plus floor. And for this group of schools, the kids who applied, the test scores were a strong predictor of performance in college. As kids had higher test scores, their grades at Duke and Stanford and Brown went up in a straight line. But kids with higher GPAs in high school, the 3.1 to a 3.9 to a 4.0, there was minimal differential. The difference at 3.1, you got a 3.45 GPA at Duke or Harvard or Stanford. And with a 4.0, you're only up to a 3.55. So they found that test scores were a very strong predictor of performance in college, but high school GPA, much less so. And that sparked a wave of test return requirements in the Ivies and Ivy Plus. So this is the research here that really fueled this starting last year. All right, and UT I mentioned, it's the same thing. The freshmen who sent test scores were doing better academically, so it was a predictor of performance at UT. And over at Emory, down the street from where I live, John Ladding said, we aren't as trusting of GPA these days. Grades are definitely inflated, not tied to class performance. And so they're looking to weight other assessments more heavily. And that includes testing, that includes AP scores, IB scores, and the SAT. So Emory is test optional, but they're telling you we are putting more focus, and that shows in their differential admit rates for kids with and without test scores. So this is a test optional world, but optional does not mean blind at all. That's the key takeaway. So we found that strong test scores can influence, they can push the lever, they demonstrate your ability that you're ready for college level work. And especially, as Bob mentioned, for the STEM-oriented majors, where that math score is really, really important to figure out, are you going to be able to handle the higher level math? It's not the ACT science score, which really is not that much of a math test, but that math score on either the SAT or ACT does help predict who will do well in college. Additionally, money. When it comes to money, test scores play a factor, especially at the state schools, and especially when it comes to merit-based aid. That's tied to your grades, that's tied to your testing. And so one school I always point to is Alabama, where my niece applied. She ended up with a 1390 on the SAT. And she had, of course, high GPA, 3.940. And with that, that strong score at 1390, that put her in the UA Scholar category, which meant that her tuition, she lives in Richmond, went from $33,000 last year, and it dropped down to about $8,500. So that's a meaningful savings of $96,000 over 4 years. And that's how Alabama is stealing kids from Dartmouth and Kenyon and Oberlin. And, because again, if they get the top scholarship, tuition goes down to $5,000 versus at some of these schools, tuition's 80 grand or, high 60s. So grand scheme of things, this can affect money, especially at some of the Southern state schools where we're seeing more of this, but at schools all over the country, liberal arts schools, they're willing to pay kids for really good grades and good testing. So that's one of the reasons why we do what we do, for that return on the investment. So there's the question of, should my students still prioritize testing given the things it's optional? Well, we now keep hitting the same point, but optional and irrelevant are very different things. Many things in life are optional that still are highly impactful. And here is one of the slides that we saw that Bob mentioned in terms of the differential admit rates. There are some schools like Yale who they were test optional. And for several years during the pandemic, they were telling people, we're reviewing applications equally with and without testing. When they finally flipped test required, they said, truth be told, we were admitting kids with test scores at 3 times the rate as those without test scores. So we felt we were being disingenuous. Same thing at Boston College. They've now changed their guidance, Colgate, Notre Dame, Emory, other schools like that. So again, they're optional, but there's a difference. There's definitely a delta there. Other schools who are optional, they're giving you some clues, words like something that's from Grinnell, score might help you. If you don't submit a score, we have less information about you. Boston College, they say students who complete testing are encouraged. If you see the word encouraged or help, that's a good clue that test scores matter to that admissions office. And we're finding that, more schools are submitting, more students are choosing to submit test scores now than during the pandemic. We are now over the halfway mark that more kids are sending scores via the Common App than those who are withholding scores. So it's that the tide is turning and test submission is on the move and is increasing, especially at schools who are highly selective. Schools who are much less selective, test scores mean less, but most people who are looking at a school that's an admit rate under 30%, under 40%, test scores can play a bigger role. All right. So then now we're talking about the two tests. We're in the world of duopoly. We have been for a long time with the SAT and the ACT, and they've been both undergoing changes. The SAT, as you are probably now well aware, it is a digital test, a digital adaptive test. And the ACT is going to be a linear test, but it changed in April on the digital version, and it's changing in September for the paper version. And I'll walk through some of those changes and how it means. So the core ACT, what they're calling it is, in their marketing speak, is the enhanced ACT, but it's not really enhanced, it's just shorter. And they're making science optional. So it's a shorter test with optional science, but I wouldn't call it an enhanced. That's kind of a euphemism I don't really prefer. But the SAT, you have your verbal section, your baseline, your adaptive, 10-minute break, your baseline math, your adaptive math, and you're done. That's going to be on your computer. You bring your own device to the school. It's a short and sweet, 2 hours for 2 minutes. Now, the new ACT, starting next month, starting in September, in either paper or digital version will be the same format. You have a short reading, short English, short math, and then science is optional if you want it, not required. Though we do recommend students take it at least one time in case you find a school who requires it. And there aren't that many, but things could be changing. Things might change next month. We're still waiting and filling in the gaps as colleges announce what they're doing with this optional science. In the fall, only a small number of schools have actually taken firm positions, which is really strange. So the assumption is just take it once and have it as a backdrop. So the digital ACT, it's not adaptive, it doesn't change. With the SAT, it's section adaptive. So if I do well, here I'll show you this. If I do on my baseline test more than 2/3 right on my baseline verbal, then more than 2/3 right, they're going to shift me into an adaptive section that's harder. So it's a more advanced section. If I get more than a third wrong, I'm going to an easier adaptive module next. So verbal, 2 sections, baseline adaptive, take a break, then math, baseline test that everyone takes the same test with a smattering of easy, medium, hard questions. And then it throws me into either an easier module or hard module. And then I'm done. That's it. So I have 2 adaptive modules and 2 static modules. That's the digital SAT, which is adaptive. Now, one thing to note, the SAT is a more advanced reading test. The reading level of the SAT is roughly the 11th grade level of reading. They intentionally began throwing in more advanced material, Shakespeare, you might see Milton, you might see John Updike. They're going to show so there's more advanced vocabulary, more complex sentence structures. That's the SAT by design. Now, the SAT, one of the also things where they stand out is the amount of time per question. It is definitely less of a speed test than the ACT. You can see here with a new timing on the verbal for the SAT, you have 71 seconds per question versus 52. Now, again, it's a more advanced reading level, but still most of our students feel like the SAT is less speedy. And then same thing on the math section, you have an extra 29 seconds per question on the SAT. And this used to be even more extreme before the ACT changed their format. They used to be even speedier. So this is actually better for kids, but so 40% more time on math and 36 on verbal. That's still a big difference. Now, the ACT is not as efficient because it's not adaptive. So you have to have more items. There are more questions on the ACT. So to get to verbal, to your final score on the SAT, they can get there in 54 questions. versus the ACT to get the same number, they need 86 questions. So they need more questions, and they aren't as generous on timing. And that's the beauty of the adaptive thing, because with the adaptive module, I'm only going to ask you questions that are relevant to your kid. If your kid did really, really well on the baseline, I'll ask your child harder questions. If they didn't do as well, I'll ask easier questions, and that's how I can eliminate some of those extraneous questions. But the ACT is an adaptive, so they have to ask a broader swath of easy, middle, and hard questions. That's why it's more time intensive. So total items on the SAT, 98. On the ACT without science, it's 131. With science, it's 171. So still quite a meaningful difference there. All right, now the test dates. One of the best things about this year for testing for the SAT, for the first time in history, they have added a September test date. I remember back in 2017 when they added the August test date, and we were all excited for summer testing. But now we have early summer testing and then early fall testing, which is great for those early deadlines. So we're going to have seniors taking September, having no problem being done with their test scores, having everything finished by the early deadlines for, could be October 15th or November 1st. So that is great for students. Now we have 5 in a row. And kids who are applying regular decision for Jan 1st, they have 5 test dates back to back to back to back to back. That's great. Now the ACT is a more advanced math test. The STEM content, there is a whole separate science section, which is mostly math and reading, but still there's some science material. And in the math section, there's more advanced math than you'll ever see. It goes into essentially pre-cal, whereas, SAT tops out Algebra 2 and a tiny bit of trig. Now, the core ACT, it arrived digitally in April, and starting in September, every single test, paper and digital, will be in this new format. This changes the current ACT. That slide only works for another few days with the last July ACT, and then it'll just be this new one. You can see, though, the reduction. We went from 75 English questions down to 50, big reduction. 60 math to 45, but science didn't budge. They just gave kids more time per question, from 35 minutes to 45. So science is less speedy. That's one nice thing, and reading is a little bit less speedy. But honestly, math and English, kids are still struggling with finishing. So that's one thing we saw that. So there is a little bit less speedy. You can see that the delta in reading and science. That's very meaningful. But what they did is they increased the level of difficulty for the extant questions. So for example, for English, or let's say for math, they lopped off 15 questions, but they knocked off the first 15 questions that were the easiest. So they left you with number essentially 15 to 60. That's the new set. So you have a little more time, but the questions are harder, which made it as speedy as before. Now, science being optional, you can choose to do it or not. We think over time, science is going to go away, and that the majority of colleges are not going to require it, and eventually fewer and fewer kids do it until it just washes out, like the old essay for the SAT went away. And it's going to be a standalone separate score. So I'm going to be scored. I got a 28 on the ACT, and I got a 31 science. It'll be a separate broken out score, not part of the composite, not part of a super score, and optional. And so I think eventually we're going to see this thing really fading away. But for now, take it. So we were hopeful that with these changes in April, it was going to be less of a speed test, but it turns out, no, it's still a speed test. So in comparison to the less speedy SAT, timing is still going to be a challenge for kids who have processing speed deficits or issues. And that's where having an accommodation is really powerful on the ACT. If you have time and a half or double time, it's going to make a huge difference on the ACT and less of a difference on the SAT in our experience. And now we finally have materials to practice. We had none for those April tests, but in May we got 4 new books, 4 new practice tests. And so that's helpful. We're working with those. And one thing we're advising everybody is do not take the digital ACT by choice. If your school is giving it to you on a school day test, that's fine. But if you have the option of taking the paper ACT or the computer-based, go with the paper. We feel like the Blue Book application, which is what runs the SAT, the College Board's application, is much better Then ACT, they have a partnership with Pearson's TestNav, and TestNav isn't as good. You also currently cannot bring your own device. And so you show up and they give you a Chromebook. You might have, and then there were even problems with the screen resolution where it didn't show the full screen, like part of the buttons at the bottom were cut off because the screens are too small. Some kids had a hard time with, like, the trackpads were wonky. Them not being able to allow you to bring your own device is a liability. So they'll fix this eventually. And here's part of the thing also. Students have been taking the ACT digitally since 2019 internationally. So it's not new having a computer-based ACT, but we just say if you have the option of paper versus computer, take it on paper. That's pure and simple advice there, if given the choice. So BU is one of the first schools to come out. Actually, it was in late April. They said, hey, we are test optional, but if you're going to submit your ACT score, we insist that you submit the ACT science section, which is kind of weird. Tests are optional, but if you send an ACT, we want science. But that's a rare position. Colleges don't need science. Stanford, Harvard, Brown, Cornell, Purdue, UGA, Georgia Tech. And to me, the fact that Georgia Tech doesn't care about science is really telling that it's not much of a science test. And it really is more of a reading test with a little light math. And that's why I think, and it correlates really highly with your composite score. So if I keep science in there or take it out, the net change in your composite score is 0.2. So I go from 26 to 26.2 with or without science on average, looking at the 1.3 million kids taking the ACT. So I think over time, schools are just going to say, we don't care, we don't require it. But there are a few schools like BU say we still want to see it for now, at least for now. Now, so the rollout happens in September, and then you'll still see some districts who have old deals who are going to be using the old format ACT in the fall and even the winter. But come the spring, every single test in a district, in a state, school-day testing, it's all going to be this new, shorter core/enhanced ACT. All right, and now, so the next test date for ACT, we have September, then October, then December, and everything goes core in September. All right, and so the name of the game, you want to find the right test and the right format right now. Let me actually pause a second. So in terms of the full versus the core ACT, they're very similar tests. And this new ACT is not really that new in terms of content. It's the same content we've seen for the last, like 30 or so years. It's just there's less of it and it's more advanced. So they kind of move the material harder and less material, but not different question types. So it's very familiar. We had to, change our book up. It was changing the formatting more than changing the strategies. And so we advise students take the science section at least one time. And we advise, in terms of when you build your testing plan, plan on taking 3 official tests. So the best thing to do is get a baseline test. Take a baseline practice SAT and a baseline practice ACT. You can use your PSAT or your pre-ACT score from school as the score, but ideally those are taken pretty close together, so there aren't any lags in maturation. If you had a PSAT from last October and you take the ACT now, there could be some growth because you've seen more material. You've seen more of that Algebra 2. And so I think that could affect performance. Ideally, and these tests are now short. Remember that. The SAT is 2 hours and 14 minutes. ACT is, without science, 2 hours and 5 minutes. So you could, on a given weekend, take one on Saturday, one on Sunday, boom, or just one, 2 weekends apart, and then you have your dual baseline. And then from there, we can decide which is your best test. We build a testing plan out for you and plan on taking the test 3 times officially. So if I'm better on the SAT, I'm going to plan on taking 3 in a row. And it could be, if I'm a junior, I might go ahead and take the November, December, March, or I might wait until the spring, and I could do a March, May, and June. That we have now, June, August, September really opens things up, having 8 test dates, which is very nice. All right, and this is the structure. So the SAT, starting in August, we have August, October, November, December, March, May, June, and then September. And then for the ACT, you have 7 currently: September, October, December, February, April, June, July. And so the core came out, and as of September, every test for the ACT is the new core enhanced ACT. All right, Bob, this is handing it back to you.
Yeah. So it's the middle of July. And as Jed and I have stressed, it's a point where if you're the parent of a rising senior, if you're a rising senior, if you're the parent of a rising junior or a rising junior yourself, you need a testing plan. I think recent surveys have indicated more than 70% of the rising junior class plans on taking a standardized test, and most of them have shifted their window to fall rather than pushing it out to spring. So, in our work with students, we are urging them not to show up to school without a plan, without a strategy for how they will handle standardized testing. So, what I'd like to do is take you through the advice we're giving families and really try to work through what that means for you and your students. So, the next slide, Jed. Okay, rising juniors. So, students who completed their sophomore year this past May, in a couple of weeks, they'll show up and realize, wow, I'm a junior in high school. The first thing we're suggesting is that a student take a diagnostic SAT and a diagnostic ACT. And they use those baselines to identify, is there a test that is significantly better than the other? Now, there is an asterisk to this, and that is, has a student completed Algebra 2? If a student, a rising junior, has not completed Algebra 2, then the test is actually not going to be an accurate representation of their math knowledge because it leans heavily on Algebra 2. Jed, can you give a sense of the students that you work with, the kind of counseling and coaching you give them if they're taking Algebra 2 during junior year, which is an outlier for math sequence
Yeah,
at most high schools? Most high schools, the math sequence is Algebra 2 sophomore year, pre-calc junior year, calc senior year. Jed, when a student is taking Algebra 2 in junior year, what advice do you give them?
yeah. We don't want to have to ever teach them content de novo, like freshly. We want to be able to review material, not try to cover a whole semester worth. So we advise students, if you're currently in Algebra 2 as a junior, your earliest test possible would be the February ACT or the March SAT. You want you to get at least one full semester of Algebra 2 under your belt, learn the foundations of, the graphing and the function notation, the functions. And then from there, because we don't want to ever be the one teaching you the quad formula or teaching you, the basics of graphing and plotting. That should be built in before you do any kind of test preparation. So that's pretty much it. You're waiting until the spring of junior year to do any testing.
Great. Now, once a student has taken those diagnostics, we're encouraging them to build a timeline. And that timeline, as I mentioned before, has shifted to a larger percentage of students planning on taking their first test in the August-September range before junior year really comes into focus academically. As a result, we're seeing many students take advantage of a less busy summer schedule to begin their prep. When we work with students, they're typically looking at about an 8 to 12 week prep window, 2 to 3 sessions per week. And what I would say is there are wonderful resources out there, but what we've found is if a student can dig in, if a student can really, really make this a priority, oftentimes that comes through a battery of practice tests, then a student really can be in a strong situation. And there are more and more students who are one and done, who dig in, they make the commitment, and they get that score. Now, what I encourage juniors to do is to set a goal. is to take either their dream school or the most competitive school on their current college list and set the top quartile as their target. So, a classic example, we work with a whole host of students who apply to the University of Texas at Austin. A 1450 is a great target score because it can motivate a student who is really, really dialed in to being a Longhorn. And the good news is that every school shares their distribution of test score ranges for their admitted students. So it's something that we stress with students, we'll talk with them, and it's a precursor to the choices they make in fall of senior year, whether or not to go test optional or submit test scores. Now, if your student is in a position where they qualify for testing accommodations, mom and dad make that a priority. You'll want to work with your school counselors. You'll want to request those accommodations on the standardized tests. We encourage families not to have their student take a standardized test, an official test, if they qualify for accommodations, not take the test before they have the accommodations. It can be demotivating and needlessly stressful for the student. Okay. Uh, for rising juniors, this is the number one thing we've worked on in June and July with kids. We just think it's that central. And if the shifts in the class of 2025 persist, there will be more schools that are officially test required. And then we certainly assume that schools will continue to factor test scores in to the admissions review for students, which leads me to the next slide. Okay, rising seniors, the class of 2026. Okay. We are seeing a larger percentage of students plan to retest. They're planning to take an August, September test date because they feel like if they can pick up 50 to 100 points on the SAT or 1 to 3 points on the ACT, it can make a difference at the more competitive schools on their list. And the honest answer is it will. It will make a difference. And so, what we are seeing students do is look at their score when it's below a target to identify their weaknesses and to retest strategically. Now, this is a consideration for some kids based on the admissions deadlines for those schools. There are a number of Southern schools that go with a earlier hard deadline, middle of October. A larger percentage of schools have a November 1st deadline. And then there are some schools who have regular decision deadlines in December and January. This is a strategic call. This is not a one size fits all call. And it is sometimes a bet on, do I feel like I can improve that test score? And as a result, go regular decision versus early action. Okay. Early action does not improve the admissions odds for a student's application at a school. It simply qualifies them to be told earlier than the rest of the applicants who don't hit the early action date. And so there are many kids who look at fall of senior year and say, I really want to tell the strongest academic story I can. So I'm going to continue to test, some even picking up an October test date. They continue to test and they look to the regular decision deadline as opposed to the early action deadline. Jed, one of the questions that has come up is a question around accommodations
Yeah.
for either the SAT or the ACT. And I know this is a consideration for many families. Can you talk a little bit about accommodations for these standardized tests?
Yep. So accommodations, they hinge upon having a diagnosed disability And having a school-based accommodation, having an IEP, having a 504, having a school-based plan if you're in a private school, and then having evidence that you actually use the accommodation that you have been granted because of your disability. Typically, processing speed, ADHD, things of that nature, dyslexia, and there's a whole host. But 3/4 of accommodations are for extra time. The most popular is time and a half, and then a small portion of kids get double time or even triple time if they have really advanced processing or visual acuity or reading issues. So the SAT, it's pretty basic. If you get your SSD number and you're approved, you get the same accommodation for everything they offer over the College Board. Every AP exam, if you're time and a half, it's on every AP exam. It's on the PSAT, it's on the SAT. Versus the ACT, you're applying for an individual test date. It's not, I don't have a code and it's good for everything. And so in our experience, if you have an accommodation, and you're using it and your school honors it, and because you apply through your school, unless you're a homeschool kid, and the disabilities coordinator at your school is the one who puts forth the paperwork, interacts with the disabilities team over at the College Board or the ACT, and they get the approval. And so it's pretty simple, pretty basic. And in our experience, I mentioned earlier that because the ACT is still a speedier test, getting an accommodation for time and a half or double time on the ACT is a more valuable accommodation than on the SAT. But we see students, some kids are just better on the SAT, and so they use their time and a half there. But pretty much anyone who got more time on the ACT would have an edge because it's still pretty speedy, even in the new format. But if you have an accommodation and you have a disability and you use it at school, definitely apply for it and apply a little bit early. It takes some time to go through the process and get the approval. But we've seen that both the ACT and the College Board become more lenient after a number of lawsuits that were filed for discrimination. They weren't getting their accommodations, or they weren't giving them broadly enough. So we're seeing the vast majority of kids who are applying for accommodations, given their 504 and IEPs in their high schools, getting the accommodation through these testing organizations.
Jed, can you hit the next slide, which will talk a little bit more about the considerations for neurodiverse students? So we've talked a little bit about accommodations. Many families will have worked with an EdPsych expert around testing for a student. We honestly see some really transformational impact for some students academically when they have a better sense of their learning style. A testing timeline for a neurodiverse student can be very different. We frankly are not big fans of neurodiverse students juggling peaks of academic assignments and tests at school and test prep. We generally feel like for kids, it's best to focus on classroom dynamics and to make sure that the timing of a standardized test doesn't conflict with the assignments and the tests that a student is taking. We do also find, and Jed has been a person who's really shown us this in his work with students, is that practice tests with accommodations are a powerful indicator. They really, really can help. And I'll mention a student that I worked with last year and the almost sea change she had in her level of testing anxiety, in a sense of, I know this test is high stakes. I understand that so much of my opportunity for my dream school depends on this. And it can be really stressful. I know as an adult, I don't envy these kids working through these tests. And a practice test, not 20 of them, but a consistent foundation of practice tests can really, really make an impact for kids. Now, Jed, when we're on the topic of practice tests, one of the questions has been, is there any difference by testing section and the improvement versus slower improvement versus for test prep? So, as an example, is there anything that is, in your experience, different when a student is prepping and their improvement on math versus English?
Typically we see, I mean, I can go through, the average gains by section, and it's going to vary by student. There really is something that's some kids start, their verbal scores is much higher than their math score, and so I expect there's some low-hanging fruit on the math score. But they're pretty close. I can show you also the three section scores for the ACT, but one difference, like English was always like we're averaging like a 5.4 point gain on English, a little bit higher than the math's a little bit lower than that. So it seems like the English points were a little bit easier on the ACT than, let's say, the math points or the reading points. It was like 5 and then 4, 3.9 points. Globally, like kids, are gaining points in every single section. So there's room to grow. And I'd say for the SAT, we're not seeing a big difference between the math and the verbal. They're both, you can definitely move the bar and you can definitely improve with preparation. But of the ACT sections, I would say just English is of the three that were required, the easiest of those, and science included. But yeah, kids can get points with prep on every single section, and it does, like, the rate of improvement is going to vary by student and also where they're starting from. If you're starting from a 720 math and a 500 and verbal, well, guess what? We're going to get you, some easy points pretty quickly on verbal, but that going from 720 to a 780, that's a bigger lift than a 5 to a 580. So there's some difference there in terms of where your starting point is.
Great. And Jed, just because you've done so much work with kids and even research around practice tests, can you I think it's always powerful for parents to understand the mix of a one-on-one relationship with a tutor versus practice tests. Can you talk a little bit about what you've seen as sort of how that mix can really impact a student's improvement?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there are different levels of preparation. There's self-preparation, and some kids are very self-directed, self-driven. All they need is materials, and they're Khan Academy, practice tests, books, and they're gonna drive. They're gonna focus. They're gonna put in the time and the work. And then you have group classes where you show up and there's a bunch of kids and you're teaching kind of to the midpoint of the class, a little bit of personalization. And then you have the private tuition, the single one student, one tutor, and they're just focusing on exactly what you missed, exactly what you need, and nothing else. And so the private piece is more efficient by its very nature. I mean, it's more resource intensive. You have one tutor, one student, but you definitely, like, the 1 hour of private tutoring is more valuable than an hour of group or an hour of self-preparation, just because it's so incredibly focused. And in terms of, the difference, some kids are going to really respond to the accountability that comes with having one person and paying attention to how you're doing, the homework I assigned, versus other kids, that they might blow it off for a group or by themselves for self-prep. So there's for sure a difference in motivation, a difference in, the structuring, the accountability when you do the private piece. There's also a cost differential, so I'm very well aware of that, which is why we have, different options. We have self-paced prep, we have group classes, then we have one-on-one private tutoring, which is not for everyone, but ultimately it is the gold standard if that's, something that's possible. But some kids, again, they just need a book, they need a website, and they're off to the races, and that's great. But like the reason I hire a personal trainer to work out, sometimes having accountability makes a difference. I actually show up versus I'm not feeling like going to the gym today, but I know Johnny's waiting for me, and so I'm going to show up and do it. So accountability is, I think, a major part of it, that someone's keeping you on the hook. And when you aren't doing the homework Sunday, you're thinking, I'm going to let down Eliza if I don't do the homework. That actually keeps you, accountable to them.
Perfect. Okay. Next slide. One of the things that we want to share is sort of the immediate action items. Make sure you're to a place where you know which test is best. Schedule a time to start prepping and make sure if you need accommodations that you're on a track towards those accommodations. Next slide, Jed. Right now, we are seeing across the country a whole set of students on track to do live practice tests at the beginning of August. It just makes sense. So we're going to share a quick poll. If you'd like us to follow up with you and provide you with some additional support and information, If you'd like us to provide you with information around the practice tests in the first 3 weeks in August, these are times where, as kids' attention shifts back to all things academic, an in person practice test can be a meaningful dry run for kids. And so our Smart Start effort is really focused on helping parents and students take the energy that they have about colleges on their list and transfer it to a motivated approach to test score improvement. So if you'd like us to follow up with you, please let us know. Just give us quick information. You've been great at sharing your questions. Jed and I are going to stay on for a couple more minutes in case you have questions that we haven't been able to answer. Again, I want to remind everybody we'll be sending you the recording tomorrow as well as the materials that we discuss. And we'll also send you quick information about how to sign up for one of these Smart Start in-person practice tests in the beginning of August. But again, we really appreciate you spending time with us this evening. And if you have any questions that we haven't been able to answer, please feel free to pop them in the Q&A box. If not, we hope all of you have a great rest of the evening. And we hope the last few weeks of summer are sensational for you and your students.
All right, question. Thank you, Stanley. Can you split up scores from different test dates? Yes, that's called superscoring. And superscoring is very, very commonly accepted on the SAT. So let's say I get a 680 on my math score for the March test, and then that's my best of my 3 scores. And then I get a 710 in May. They will superscore my 710 and 680. So I have a 1390, even though I never scored more than a 1340 on any one given test date. Superscoring is widely accepted for the SAT and is gaining currency on the ACT, about half of schools at least. For many, many years, the ACT said, don't superscore, we don't believe in it. Then they came out with their own research saying, actually, it does predict college GPA the best. And they began to endorse superscoring a couple years ago. So they're now pretty widely accepted. You can go on the school's website and find out, or go on College Board's Big Futures website, type in the name of the college under testing, applying, and it'll show you if they superscore or not. Is there a benefit at schools like MIT if I get an 800 for a 790? No, that's not meaningful. That's honestly, like, the margin of error on each test is 30 points. So that's not a meaningful difference. 800 versus a 710, that's meaningful. But those kind of 10-point, 20-point differences are not substantial, and it could be just a right or wrong guess on one question, not really indicative of the difference in ability level. If someone is at a 1300, is it better to have them on a one-on-one session or a group? You're anything between 1,000 and 1,200. I typically say that's about the sweet spot for the group if you're pretty well balanced. Once you start getting up in the 1,300s, that's where I start wanting to focus more, because you've mastered a lot of material. You're already the top 15 percentile in the country, and you're getting a lot of content right. And I would say at 1,300, I want to start moving towards individual, unless you find a higher scoring group. And that's because typically we're going to teach to around the 1,100-1,200 level. So there'll be a lot of material your kids already mastered if they go in there with a 1,300. So I think private may be more efficient for that student. Do you offer one-on-one? Yes. And for one subject, for sure. You could buy 4 hours of verbal. You could buy 6 hours of math. You're not locked in. And you could absolutely, because some kids, they have 720 on verbal and 580 math. We want to really hit that math, especially if they're looking at an engineering program or STEM program. And in terms of pricing, there's some differences in terms of by market. We tend to do an hourly rate for tuition. We also have a couple different levels of tutoring, from a preferred level to the premium to our top tier. People who've been here about 10 years or so, plus the elite level, who some people just want, who's the best people in your of your whole team. But if you want, we could send a pricing sheet with the different prices based on where you are in the country. And in terms of, do we offer classes at local schools in person? In the markets where we have in person, we have the Atlanta market, we have the DC market, DC, Maryland, Virginia. We have the New York City market. We are in person in Chicago, over in Austin, in Seattle. But otherwise, we're everywhere remotely. And we have tutors in many, many states and different countries. And the pool is much faster. So we offer both in person and we offer remote tutoring. But I would say about 3/4 of our tutoring post-pandemic is online. And Apple Ruth, we were doing online tutoring in 2014, 2013. So it's not new for us. We were using Cisco's WebEx product, and we were using we were just Skype and then WizIQ, and then we were doing Zoom in 2017 before people heard about Zoom. It's been on our radar for a long time. And so we have a lot of experience with our digital materials, and remote works great. I've only done remote tutoring for about 10 years, and it works very, very well. Kids
Great. We
can, yeah.
so appreciate everybody's time this evening. As we said, we'll be sending out some follow-up email tomorrow, and we wish you and your students a great rest of the summer. Thanks so much.
All right, y'all. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye now.